recording. So I'm going to briefly go over the rest of the things that are due for this unit for Chapter 7. And we'll finish the material for Chapter 7, which is not going to take very long. And then I'll give you the rest of the time today to work on those last few items that are due for this week. If we had been meeting in class, we would have had a very brief lecture, and then you would have spent the rest of the time working on the case study. So in my head, that's what you're going to do after this short video. Okay. With that, let me switch over to Canvas. Okay, so this is what you have on your Canvas page. If you go to your assignments, you have just a few assignments left for the nervous system. So the one that we would have done in class today is the case study. So if you click on this one, you'll see that it is a PDF. It goes through about monkey brains and how size can relate to function. And so what I want you to do is I want you to read the case study, and then there are questions in the case study, so type up your answers and then submit it on this page where it says submit assignment. Okay, so if you go back to the assignments page, the other assignment for this unit is the cranial nerve worksheet. This is basically just a giant chart where I want you to tell me the 12 cranial nerves, their number, their name, and then what they do. And make sure when you're doing the function that you also include some information about what kind of fibers do they contain. Is it sensory, is it motor, or is it both? Okay. The last thing you have to do for Chapter 7 is the discussion questions for this week. Remember, 2 posts a week, so 1 post in things you found confusing or interesting for week 4, and then 1 post in answering the questions for part 3. So pretty straightforward for this week's assignments here. Switch gears. Okay. Are there any questions people have about what is due for the rest of Chapter 7? If they are, please put them in the chat. And I'm going to switch over to the last part of Chapter 7 of our PowerPoint here. So where we left off, we had finished talking about our peripheral nervous system. We had gone through spinal nerves and cranial nerves. We had also talked about the autonomic nervous system, or sympathetic and parasympathetic components of that. And now we're going to end by talking about some developmental disorders and then what happens to our brains as we age. So part 6 here, the developmental aspects of the nervous system. Our objectives for this final part of Chapter 7 are to describe the causes, symptoms, and outcomes for the following disorders. You want to talk about spina bifida, anencephaly, and cerebral palsy, and then explain what happens to brains in aging. Let's start by talking about spina bifida, which is caused by an incomplete vertebrae. So recall when we were talking about how the nervous system develops, that in utero, as embryos, our nervous system starts as a tube, and that tube is going to close, it's going to form a cylinder, and then one end of the tube is going to become the brain, and the rest of the tube will be the spinal cord. Well, if the mother does not have enough folate in her diet or isn't taking a prenatal vitamin that contains folate, when that tube is closing, there might be an incomplete closure. And so if this occurs on the very base end, usually at the lumbar sacral end, so the very last part of the tube to close here, you might have an incomplete closure. And if it's just a little bit, when the child is born, they'll have a small dimple on the base of their spine or a little tuft of hair. And in very serious cases, the spinal cord itself could protrude because the vertebrae and the vertebral column are not fully formed. So the spinal cord in spina bifida is not fully protected. And as we know, we have to protect our nervous system. These are very delicate cells. They don't replicate, they're post-mitotic. And so this child needs to have surgery in order to try to repair and push back in the spinal cord and protect it again. But as you can imagine, it's a very serious surgery. It's a very serious disorder, and it's caused by low folate. This neural tube closure, again, happens very early in development, as early as week 4 of embryonic development, which for most women, you miss your period. If you have a regular cycle, you'll be getting your menstrual cycle about every 4 weeks. And so at 4 weeks, you may not even realize that you are pregnant yet. Most women won't know they're pregnant. And so you might not be taking prenatal vitamins at that point, which is why for women, if you are of childbearing age and you want to get pregnant and you think you might become pregnant soon, the best thing you could do is to start taking prenatal vitamins, because prenatal vitamins will have that folate in it and will help give your child all the nutrients it needs to grow and develop before you even know you're pregnant. Because the nervous system is one of the first things that develops. It happens very early on and is sensitive to nutrition levels starting pretty quickly. The other thing that can happen from low folate is even more serious. This is called anencephaly, which is the absence of a large portion of the brain. This is also a neural tube defect. This is when the issue is at the other end of the neural tube, the more superior end of the neural tube as opposed to the inferior end. So if the superior end doesn't form that bulb and form a brain structure, the child could be born without most of their cerebrum. Keep in mind the cerebrum, those are the 4 lobes that we talked about, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and they might be either partially or completely missing in an anencephaly baby. These children are usually miscarried early on, but if they're born, they die usually within a few hours to a few days because their brain is most of their brain structure is absent. And this is again caused by low folate. So you need folate in order to close that neural tube. You might have also heard of anencephaly a few years ago when there was the growing concern of the Zika virus. I know we're living through a current pandemic. We may have forgotten about past medical catastrophes, but Zika was a big deal because it caused pregnant women to give birth to anencephaly children. And the exact link between the Zika virus and why they had that neural tube defect is not fully known, but that was why women, especially pregnant women, were so concerned, was that the virus had been shown to cause not all pregnant women, but a higher number of pregnant women to either miscarry or give birth to a child with anencephaly or an absence of a large portion of the brain. The final developmental disorder I want to talk about is cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a general classification that we give to movement disorders that appear in early childhood and are caused by low oxygen, specifically either in the last part of embryonic and fetal development, so your last trimester, or during childbirth itself. So some babies, as you know, can have cord wrapped around their neck or might have some issues and might not be getting enough oxygen to their brain, specifically during delivery. And the brain is the organ that is the first to react to low oxygen. So I don't know if you guys ever like wrestle or fight or box. I'm not a fighter, so I can't tell you. But what I do know is if you choke a person out, what they will do is they'll pass out. So the first response to someone being choked is to try to preserve that brain, because the brain is the first thing to react to low oxygen. So the first thing that will happen is if you start to lose your oxygen, you'll go unconscious. The brain needs a constant supply of oxygen and it needs glucose. And so if a child during delivery is having low oxygen, it can cause damage to regions of the brain. And usually the symptoms include poor voluntary muscle control. So they have a hard time with fine movement. They might be confined to a wheelchair. 50% will also have mental retardation or seizures, depending on how long their brain went without oxygen. So again, brains, they need oxygen. Okay. So what I hope you can answer from this first part is examples of neurological disorders caused by low maternal levels of folate or low oxygen during birth. So we covered 2 disorders for low folate and the 1 for low oxygen during birth. Let's finally talk about brains and what happens to brains as we age. As I think you guys know, my research is in Alzheimer's. That's where I did my PhD and my fellowship in. And so aging brains is something that I could talk about for a whole class, a whole week, a whole semester. But I am instead going to limit myself to just this one slide. So I first want to talk about how brains change from infant to adulthood, and then how they change from adulthood to elderly people. So starting as infants, the first thing you'll notice about children to adults is that their brain increases in size. Usually it's about 5 times infant brain size to adulthood size. And the interesting thing is that this increase in size is not due to an increase in the number of neurons. You are born with the majority of the neurons that you will have for the rest of your life. Again, neurons are post-mitotic, they're not going to replicate, but what they will do is they will increase in complexity. And so if you show on the bottom here is a picture of what neurons look like at birth, at 7, and at 15. And at birth, the neurons, they're short, they don't have a lot of processes, they're not shooting out a lot of dendrites, they're not forming a lot of networks. This is what neurons do. They look like a mesh of wires because the neurons are reaching out and touching each other and forming synaptic connections. And so from birth through childhood, the neuron number is not going to increase, but what will increase is the number of connections to other neurons. They'll be making a large, we call it a neural network. So they'll be reaching out and touching a bunch of neurons, and they'll also be myelinating themselves to speed up that connection and that signaling. Now, as we move from childhood through puberty, our brain will undergo a period of pruning. And pruning is the process by which our brains get rid of some of the unneeded connections. And so basically, the neurons will reach out a bunch of connections in childhood, and then starting in your teenage years, your brain will say, we don't really need that connection, we can pull it back. And it will instead strengthen the ones that you use all the time. Keep in mind that those connections in a lot of the neural networks are what you learned, what you remember, what your personality is. All of that is stored in the touching of neurons. And so the things that you use all the time, the skills that you use all the time, those neural connections are going to be strengthened. And the things that you don't use very often, those will be pulled back and pruned. Now, the majority of your pruning will occur during puberty, but you can still prune your neural networks by either strengthening things you want and getting rid of no longer needed connections. Pruning still happens throughout your life, and pruning actually happens when you sleep. So when you're studying for a test, for example, you're going to learn information and it will be encoded in your brain by the physical connection of neurons. And to strengthen that, you have to sleep. And you have to use that information. And so that's just a fun little tidbit about studying why you should get lots of sleep before your exams. And you should also use and study that information because both of those things together are what going to strengthen that learning and make you really know something. So the bulk of your pruning happens in your teenage years. You can still prune throughout your lifetime. It's not quite as large scale. The pruning that happens during puberty is large scale. It's visible. As you look at the picture down at the bottom, there is a very big difference between what the brain looks like in a 7-year-old compared to a 15-year-old. And this pruning, the bulk pruning, will end again at different times for women. Your connections, your networks are fully set up by the time you're about 20. For men, it takes about the mid-20s. The last network to strengthen is that frontal lobe section. Again, that is problem solving and thinking through the consequences of your actions. A little bit earlier for women than it is for men. I'm sure that is not surprising to most people. The last thing I want to talk about for middle-aged brains is this idea of plasticity. So plasticity means, for neuroscientists, the brain is adaptable. So when a child gets a brain tumor, very sad, if they're able to do surgery and remove that tumor, they might have some symptoms depending on where that tumor was localized. So say they get a tumor in the area of their brain that is responsible for sensing their arm. Well, they might have some sensory input issues for their arm. But in kids, brains are really plastic. And so another part of the brain might say, hey, I can do arm sensing in addition to what I'm doing. And that function may move. That's what we mean by plasticity, is that the function is not set. It is instead adaptable and movable. And when you are born with a high degree of plasticity, our brains can do a lot of different things. And as we age, we lose plasticity. This is why things like strokes and tumors are a much bigger deal in old people, because their brains can't adapt as well. The other thing that happens as we age is we get a rise of dementia, which is usually a memory loss type of disorder, but you also lose cognitive abilities, so critical thinking, problem solving, all of that. And it's thought that the rise of dementia or the lead up to dementia, it's usually caused by issues with circulation. So it's usually caused by an underlying heart disease. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this again is that we're born with all the neurons we're going to have. Kids will increase their neural networks, their neural connections, and then we'll prune them back. And the system, the brain system, starts as very plastic, and we lose plasticity as we age. And some people develop dementia and other disorders as they age, in large part because of circulatory issues. Okay. I'm going to stop there for chapter 7. We've reached the end of the material. We went over a few developmental disorders, and then I went on a few different tangents about brains and aging brains. And I will take any questions you guys have. Otherwise, please use the rest of this time to work on that cranial nerve worksheet and that case study, and start studying chapter 7. And we will pick up with chapter 8, our senses, on Friday.